Since the topic of this panel is water and the environment, I thought we could start by talking about what's known as environmental flows, sort of the health of rivers and ecosystems, which to my mind is perhaps an often overlooked part of the water equation. Here in Texas, we talk about water supplies to people, but you know what happens if our rivers aren't healthy and so on. And maybe, Senator, I can start with you. Can you talk a little bit about what are environmental flows and why do they matter?
Well, yes, thank you. Really pleased to be here today. And the environmental flows issue has been brewing for quite some time. And when somebody decided it would be a good idea to file for a permit for all unappropriated water in a certain river basin, it raised some eyebrows. And their intentions were that whatever was not being used at the time should be preserved for environmental flows. Environmental flows, obviously, is the concept of maintaining a sufficient flow of water throughout a river system so that it protects natural species and everything that goes along with the natural species, which includes commerce and development and all of those things, especially down towards the coast. And a healthy flow of rivers maintains a healthy environment, and a healthy environment maintains a healthy economy. And the idea is that without some sort of management tool, without some sort of process, that the flows will not be maintained as the demand on the upper ends and throughout the river basin are increased. So obviously processes were set in motion, and there was a move to come up with a scientific method to determine what the appropriate level of flow in each separate river basin would be. And that process was begun in the session before Senate Bill 3 passed. The legislation actually passed in Senate Bill 3, and I'd love to take credit for it, but my job was to not mess up all the good work that had been done before. And a lot of folks like Andy Sampson came around and said, "We've been working on this a long time, Senator, don't mess it up." So I didn't mess it up, and we passed it in Senate Bill 3. And it's a very complicated process with a whole lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds and interest groups involved in the process. And today they're working on developing that desired level of appropriate environmental flows in each river basin.
Mm-hmm. And Bob, maybe you can talk a little about the management process of overseeing the health of rivers, some of which was put in place by Senate Bill 3.
Well, as the Senator says, Senate Bill 3 was kind of the keystone legislation for this, and that work did start a long time ago and over several years developed and was finally passed in 2007, if I'm not mistaken. And there's lots of people in this room that have participated in the Senate Bill 3 process. Myron co-chaired one of the stakeholder groups for the Colorado. Jerry Clark chaired the stakeholder group in the Sabine, Natchez area, and there are others here that I'm not mentioning, I'm sure. It is a complex process, but it's got sort of as its fundamentals, let's take the science, and let's take the science we've got. We've been working on this problem for a very long time. Take what we've got, collect a group of knowledgeable individuals that have got the right skill set to serve as a science advisory team, have them work for 1 year time. Sounds like a long time. I guarantee it was very short for those groups to take that and come forward with scientific-based recommendations on what do we need in terms of environmental flows? And when we use the term environmental flows, we're talking about in-stream flows in the rivers and creeks, as well as flows into the coastal systems, into our bays and estuaries up and down the Texas coast. That science group takes that recommendation, which is to be based solely on what are the environmental needs. Forget the other needs for the moment. What are the environmental requirements to maintain these systems in a healthy state? Once that work is done, it then went to a stakeholder process. Again, a very broad-based stakeholders up and down the basin, all water interests, not completely unlike what Carolyn described, and you all know to be the regional water planning process under Senate Bill 1. Not a bad model, and so this again was sort of a regional or locally grown plan. That stakeholder group is the one then that was charged with taking the scientific results from their science teams and blending those and balancing those with all of the other water needs which were represented by the stakeholder groups, and come forward with a recommendation for a set of standards for environmental flows up and down the basin and the bay and estuary system that is at the bottom of each of those basins. And with those recommendations, develop a recommendation out of those stakeholder groups to go to the TCEQ for rulemaking. We have methodically stepped across the state, starting in the eastern side. The 7 major basins from the Sabine in the east to the Rio Grande in the west. All of those basins now have had their science teams report. 6 out of the 7 basins, the only one that hasn't completed their work yet is the Rio Grande. 6 of the 7 stakeholder groups have made their recommendations to TCEQ, and TCEQ has actually adopted standards that apply to new permits or to major amendments of existing permits. 4 of the basins have had rules adopted.
And Myron, is this process working? I mean, are our rivers healthy?
Well, it's sort of a spectrum across the state, and one of the challenges, I think, in understanding this issue of environmental flows is that most of the time you can go out to a river and there's plenty of water in it, and we think everything's fine. But the reality is we've issued a tremendous number of water rights, not all of which are fully used today, and we're going to grow into those as the population and demands grow. The question is, what's the health of the river going to be when you have those water rights being fully used and we experience drought? Because when it rains a lot, the rivers are healthy. That picture is not very pretty. For a lot of our rivers, we have issued enough water rights that if we fully use them, during droughts, we could dry up those rivers and really devastate the bays. And last year, we saw sort of a short snapshot of what can happen. A lot of our bays got hit really hard. We hope that that's a short drought because they can recover. Nature's really resilient, and it can recover from a pretty big assault. But if you extend that over a long period of time or you take it too far, that system is going to collapse. And I guess one of the things that I think it's really important to recognize is that this isn't just about taking care of rivers because we like fish or we like certain critters. It really is billions of dollars of economic activity that we're talking about. We're talking about rural land values. We're talking about recreational and commercial fishing along the coast. We're talking about tourism, tubing, canoeing, all those things that are dependent on healthy rivers. Our water quality. You know, we depend on river flow to treat a lot of our effluent. I mean, yes, we have water treatment plants. We treat it to a certain extent, but then we rely on the river to finish the job. Well, if that flow's not in the river, what's that going to do to our water quality? And if we had to do that treatment instead of relying on the river, that's more billions and billions of dollars. So we are not where we need to be in terms of taking care of our rivers and our coast and the economy that depends on it. But we are acknowledging, I think, with Senate Bill 3, that this is an important issue that we haven't really dealt with in a systematic way. And now we sort of have the challenge more directly in front of us and say, okay, now what are we going to do? It's one thing to say, we're going to put some limitations on future permits, but it's another thing to say, you know, we need to assess where are we with the permits we've already issued, what's the future like for this river or this bay system? That's a bigger challenge.
Is there any one particular river that's particularly at risk? Sort of.
Well, I mean, you can look at a number of them. The Rio Grande is probably the most over-appropriated. I mean, there we've literally have more rights a couple times over than there is water in drought periods. So that river system is in serious state. The Nueces River is also one that's really heavily appropriated. The amount of water reaching Nueces Bay has really been reduced, so we're seeing big impacts. In fact, the science team for the Nueces Bay said that is no longer a sound ecological environment in Nueces Bay. And over time, that situation could get worse. So that's an example of one where we're going to have to really be creative in saying, what can we do to try to keep that system as healthy as possible, while recognizing we've got these other human demands, and I say other human demands because I think that the environmental demand is an aspect of human water needs, but these other demands that we have to meet.
Mm-hmm. So, Senator, what are the next steps? I mean, we've passed Senate Bill 7 and put this management plan in place. Is there anything else that the state should be kind of proactively doing that it's not doing now to, you know, given that we, you know, as Andy said this morning, you know, have allocated more rights out of these rivers than we actually have water? I mean.
Well, the legislature never gets anything right the first time, especially something as complicated and complex as determining an appropriate level of environmental flows. It's an ongoing process, so we're learning a lot through the process. Each river basin is going through a process in a chronological order, and I think each time that we take on a new river basin, we learn more. And we're never going to stop learning, and we're never going to stop improving. So at some point, yeah, the legislature will probably look at the process again and determine whether or not the mission is accomplished or not. I thought when we passed the legislation that it was overly complex, and that it seemed like it was kind of burdensome, if you will, the process itself. But it's turned out that it's working. Some will argue that we could do a lot better, and I would agree that there's work to be done. So although I just heard Chairman Ritter say that the other issues were not the priority this session, one of these days the environmental flows process is going to come up for review again, and I'm sure that it can be improved.
Mm-hmm. Bob,
Kate, let me add to that. I won't comment on how burdensome it was. It felt kind of burdensome from time to time, but it was a complicated process. Mm-hmm. But the legislature did set the stage for what I think is going to be in the long term the solution. And that is, there was a very strong underpinning of adaptive management. Again, not unlike the Senate Bill 1 model, that this is not a one-shot deal. You don't just go out and do this, you're done, pack up and go. That adaptive management process, if we are able to intelligently utilize, you know, everything that word means or those words mean, is starts with the final charge to each of the stakeholder groups after they have developed their recommendations for standards and gone through the TCEQ rulemaking process, is to create what's called a work plan. That's where the rubber can meet the road. And that work plan is to identify where did the science, where was it short? Where were the data gaps? What are we not looking at that we needed to be looking at? It can then be the model for executing the next round of work and programs and data collection and analysis and all of those things that go into advancing the science to do a better job on the next round. That is not going to be an easy process. The work plans that have already been developed, there are 4 of them already actually completed. There's work going on to complete the other 3. They themselves are complicated documents because these are not easy questions we're trying to answer. But they can be the foundation for doing what we need to do to actually advance the science and come up with a better round of answers, because there are going to be conflicts. You don't have to move very far from the eastern part of the state, and in the last couple of years, even in those basins, as Chairman Ritter said, experienced conditions that they hadn't seen maybe ever. And as we move into the central and western part of the state, it just gets more complex to try to balance all the needs.
Right, and the conflicts sort of come, are at their most acute during the times of drought when, everybody's sort of grabbing desperately in some cases for water. I mean, ag and cities, everybody's trying to pull more out of the river. So, sort of in these kind of, I'm just sort of talking a little off my head here, but, in these sort of crisis times, I would think everyone's sort of, pulling water, and can a river and sort of Gulf areas, can they actually get the priority that they need in these sort of short-term situations where some rights, might override others? I mean, Myron, do you have?
Yeah, it is a huge challenge. One of the aspects of the work plans, and this is only one component of what we're going to have to do, charges the groups with looking at strategies to meet the environmental flow needs. So there's a recognition that where there's unappropriated water, you might be able to set some of that aside. You might be able to put conditions on new permits and say, we're going to protect that. But in a lot of our basins, from the Guadalupe, Colorado, Nueces, Rio Grande, and even Trinity, I mean, almost across the state, our reality is to meet these environmental needs, we are really going to have to start doing some proactive things. And that's one of the things the stakeholder committees are charged with doing, and that's one of the things that we need to be thinking about more in our whole water planning process. We need to be looking at this whole gamut of water needs, including the environment, and say, what can we do? How can we make this work? And there are examples. Return flows, wastewater return flows that are returned to the river. During the drought last year, there were a lot of times in the lower Colorado River where the vast majority of the flow in the river was City of Austin wastewater return flows. And trying to have that kind of commitment. We struck a deal with the City of Houston recently where they made a commitment that at least half of their wastewater return flows they would commit that they would continue to go to Galveston Bay for freshwater inflow. Those sorts of things can be done. We have to be really creative and proactive to do it. It's a challenge. As you say, drought is a really tough time when everybody's trying to figure out how do we meet our water needs. And we, on the environmental side, we have to recognize that during drought, the systems are going to be under serious stress, and they're only going to get enough to help them survive, the systems, the species survive to get through those droughts so that then they can recover in other times and thrive. So we can do it, but it really is a challenge, and one that frankly we haven't been paying the attention to that we need to so far in water planning.
I'd also throw in that the conversation that we're having about implementing the state water plan ties in directly with how effective an environmental flows policy we're going to have. As our state grows our supply of water, it makes it easier to preserve an environmental flows policy. But if we're not going to increase our water supply as our populations grow, it's just going to be harder and harder to meet the goals of an environmental flows process. So developing new even reservoirs and whatever other supplies there are 4,500 different projects and 562 different categories of ways to increase supply, but if we don't do it, then we're going to fail here.
So I also wanted to ask, I mean, you brought this up and so did Myron about the reuse. I mean, there are so many different possibilities in the water plan. There's, sort of water reuse, there's desal, building more reservoirs, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what is the most sort of environmentally benign way to method among these to get more water? And you're not allowed to say conservation, because that's obvious. Myron.
How about drought management, drought response? But seriously, I do want to talk a little bit about the drought response aspect, because I don't think we talk about it enough in our water planning, and that is recognizing that there really are some demands that we don't have to fully meet during serious drought years. I mean, that's the premise of the demands that we see in the water plan, is saying in these worst drought years, we want to, how much water does it take to fully meet all the demands on water? Lawn watering, all of that, as though there weren't a drought at all. And I think that's a maybe failed premise, that we need to recognize that some of those demands we don't really have to fully meet during droughts. We can do some reductions in demand on some of that, and that's really important as a way to balance in those the most challenging demand times. But beyond that, I think a lot of it is how you do projects. Even a water supply project where you're taking water out during wetter periods, you're storing it somehow. If you store it in an off-channel reservoir, the problem with that is the evaporation. You lose a lot of that. You can store it underground in an aquifer storage and recovery system. That's very expensive. But we're going to have to look at that. We're going to have to look at ways where you take water during those wetter periods and store it for drier periods. Well, that's a way you can do it, minimizing the environmental harm. But the other thing you can do that I think we have to look at is say, is there a way to do that? We're taking that water out during these wetter periods, and maybe during drought, we actually say, we're going to put some of that back during that serious drought for the environment. We're going to share a little bit. Make this work for everybody. Because we really have to be more creative than we've been if we're going to solve this issue. I mean, we have growing demands. We need to meet those for all across the board. And I think there are ways that we can do that if we just put our hats on and really think about, okay, how can we work together to meet all these needs at once?
Okay, one of the recommendations that has come out of virtually every one of the stakeholder groups under Senate Bill 3 when they've put their work plans together is that there needs to be a more integrated process between the Senate Bill 1 planning process that Carolyn described this morning and the environmental flows process. I mean, it is about managing the water that's available to us. We can't create more. We've got what we've got. And it's going to take, to answer the kind of challenging problems that Myron described, it's going to take an integrated process. It's going to take a process where folks don't go into it with there's going to be winners and losers here. We need to be smart enough to figure out how everyone can have a sufficient win. And I think that's doable. I mean, it's going to take some trade-offs. It's going to take some leadership. But I think doing that within the water planning process is probably the right homeroom to get that done.
Senator, is this possible?
Well, there is only one silver bullet, and you took it off the table. But we don't take conservation seriously anyway, so we won't talk about that.
Actually, I do want to ask you, is there anything the legislature can do? I kind of wanted to ask this last panel, but I get to ask questions a lot anyway, so I thought I'd leave it to everyone else. But is there anything the legislature can do conservation-wise? You know, there's probably no appetite for mandating conservation across the state blanket, but...
When you look at the state water plan and you go through all of the various regions, you'll find conservation is an integral part across the state. But you'll also notice that there's very, very little specific data about how to achieve the conservation and how to fund it. So I think it would be entirely appropriate when this next legislative session is looking at appropriating monies for the state water plan, that there be a carve out for conservation efforts. And out of the amount of money, which the amount of money that you need to implement the water plan is going to be in the neighborhood of $2 billion over a period of about 15 or 16 years. So appropriating part of that, setting aside part of that to conservation efforts, which is 24% of our goal in the plan, it will go a long way. So yeah, there are things that the legislature can do without mandating.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to add, I think it was alluded to earlier, the incentive side of things. Whereas if you are going to, you're going to get state funding, that you really has to look at and say, all right, you can get that, but you need to step up on this conservation issue in order to qualify for it. Or you're going to get you want a permit for new additional state-owned water that all the people of the state of Texas had. We do have requirements in the code that says, you need to demonstrate that you're going to use that water efficiently. I don't think we're doing a great job in implementing that. Actually, I don't think we're doing a good job at all in implementing that. We can do a better job on that, because it really is, say, we're asking for something here, you're getting something new, and there's a condition on that. And I think we can do more of that, because there really is so much we can do. And it's one point I want to make. We're looking at these projections, demands 50 years in the future. And we're saying, this is the amount of water conservation we can achieve. But we're doing that with the technology that exists today. We have 50 years. We can do a lot better. We can develop a lot better efficiencies on how we use water as we look 50 years into the future. So there really is, there is an amazing potential in water conservation. So sorry, we did talk more about that.
And it's not a two-stage switch. It's not either I conserve or I don't conserve. I had the opportunity while I was on the commission to visit a lot of plants and talk about industrial processes and so forth. There is a tremendous amount of water conservation going on within industrial facilities because it's called money. Right. It's cost that you avoid, and that technology is changing all the time. We do have a tendency, I think, to talk about this though as if you're either in favor of conservation or you're not. And it's the furthest thing from a two-stage switch.
One other thing I want to talk about before we open it up to questions is water quality. That really ties into environmental flows and sort of drought and a lot of the things we've been talking about. But how is water quality? How much at risk are we of not having kind of good enough water as we both reach for new supplies, and in times of drought, when our rivers and our lakes go really, really low. I learned last year that quality can be an issue. So how much are we paying enough attention to that, and what are some of the things we might need to look out for going forward?
Let me say this about that. Obviously, water quality is just, if the water's no good, then you might as well not have it. But there are a lot of different things that we need to be moving forward on the policy arena. We have, for example, rules and regulations that require cities to flush their pipe systems every 30 days. And from the utility managers that I talk to, there's nothing magic about 30 days. So if they were allowed to monitor their systems and flush them as necessary, I think you could see the major cities saving, I can't even describe how much water that would save if they were allowed to do it maybe only 10 times a year rather than 12 times a year, as long as they were making sure that they were meeting the necessary water quality standards. But there are things like that we need to start looking at and updating and recognizing that water is not as cheap or as available as it used to be when those regulations were initially designed.
That's interesting. Bob, do you have?
I think we're actually doing a decent job on the water quality side. There's no escaping the fact that during drought conditions, when the flows get the lowest, That's the biggest challenge to water quality. And in fact, in all of the environmental flows work that the science teams did as part of Senate Bill 3, it is really water quality that drives the scientific result down at the low end of the flow spectrum. It's pretty much all about water quality. As Myron said, that's when we put the most stress on the bays. And that's a water quality condition which can be driven by nutrients. It's clearly driven by high salinities that are put a lot of stress on the system. I think that the example of during those drought conditions that we've experienced, oftentimes many of our rivers are made up primarily of return flows from wastewater treatment. That's because we're doing a darn good job on wastewater treatment. We wouldn't have said that 30 years ago, but I actually think we're doing a pretty good job on that side of the ledger.
And I would generally agree with that. I mean, there are issues that we don't really understand real well, and one of those is the one that's called emerging pollutants. Pharmaceuticals, the reality is we take pills and not all that medicine stays inside us. And it goes down the toilet and into our rivers, and it can really affect aquatic life, and we don't understand a lot about that. So that's an issue that's out there. I think one of the big issues, the fact that we have this increasingly urbanizing state, and we have this huge runoff that's coming out of our cities. And it's producing both water quality challenges, but also real challenges in flow pattern. I mean, when it rains, we get this huge torrent of water coming off these impervious surfaces and causing erosion and creating lots of problems. I mean, you look around in your cities at so many of our urban streams that are just really kind of decimated by that runoff. And that's a challenge that I don't think we're doing a great job at.
What should we be doing about that?
Really, there's a concept of low impact development that really starts thinking about putting in place measures that capture some of that flow, slow it down, some of it percolate in the ground, but release it more slowly, not just have it all rush off at once in this huge wave of water that comes down the river, but slow that. So use your vegetation to control that. Different kinds of stormwater controls that can even that out a little bit.
Is anybody doing that well?
Yeah. Well, is anybody doing well? Well, people are doing that, and I think there are successes, and it's being looked at more and more. We talked about it in the discussion of the Edwards Aquifer Recovery Implementation Program. For recharge for the Edwards, it's so important. So we talked about some of that issue, and there are definitely, I know that the City of Houston is looking at some of those issues. So it's definitely being explored. To what great extent, I think there are successes around the country, but it's still very much in the early stages, I think. But yeah, I think we are starting to look at it more and more, and it's one of these this ongoing challenge that we have, that we do have to learn. We have to adapt. Things that, gosh, we thought, well, the perfect solution is just get that water out of here, and now we're realizing when you get it out of here at this block, the block downstream floods because it came so fast. Those sorts of issues that we are learning, and we have the potential. We're making progress on it. But
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're talking about a lot of, we've talked about big brush things here with the water plan, but it seems like, there are a lot of smaller things like that, and like what you were talking about, just spacing out the flushing of the city systems more, that we can actually do better.